So this is a potato skib. I call it a grid base potato skib because it has these 4 spaces. It's a traditional way of making the base, and it was used for straining and then serving potatoes. So I'm going to show how this is made, and then afterwards I'm also going to show how this different style of base, it's also a potato skib, this I call a Joyce Country base, so I'll also show how that base is made. So I have 6 base sticks here for making a skib, and I'm selecting the 3 thickest for splitting. And to the extent that has a belly, the curve should be downwards like that. Usually probably the thickest rod of all as the middle rod. And if some rod doesn't split so well, I think that one hasn't split that well, then I would change it and make sure it's not the middle rod, because that's the most vulnerable rod. So that's a better rod in the middle now, and butt needs to be on this side. So if the butt of that is up there, this time the butt needs to be on this side so that they're staggered. Agus oscail amach na slothy tone mar sin, and it's go spásad. Open out the base sticks to create the grid. So traditionally, I've no doubt that people would have used willow pegs like that, but they then had to be held in position, so it was a kind of a delicate maneuver. So over a period of time, I have now taken the position that I have 4 special pieces. These could just as easily be willow, but the thing that makes them relatively easy to use is the tape on top, because it means they can't fall through. So depending on the size that I would be making, if I was making a very large skib, like that one behind me, then the holes would be larger. And if I was making a very small one, I'd use these ones. But this is kind of right for the size we're at here. And you usually begin where the split rods are going north-south. So I'm just going to search for 2 fairly light weavers here. And take a tiny piece off the tips, maybe 3 to 4 inches. Traditionally, I used to always start putting 1 rod in there and the other rod in there, and that is absolutely fine. And you can just begin your pairing. But I saw a skib, I think it was now it's in the Museum of Country Life in Castlebar, and I noticed that the maker had taken the first rod and gone in a reverse position like this. So you turn that first rod back like this. So just an in-out weave, but the advantage of that is now you have a very anchored rod, and then the second rod, which was the first to be woven, slips in there, And now you can begin pairing, which is left hand rod goes in the gap the right hand rod is coming out of, and out the next gap. Agus a scoige tugam muid fiochan gás slaat seo. I kind of have made a little rule for myself not to open my solid rods until I have 2 rows of weaving, and not to open my split ones until I have about 6 rows of weaving. But they're not hard and fast rules by any means. So from now on, that will bear to be pushed out. Whereas the split rods I'm more careful of and tend not to do that for another while. And I would usually also stagger my first joins, so I'm assessing is that long enough to go over as far as there, and it is, because the first joins will usually be what I call simple joins, which means let's just lift up and place in. It's important not to have rods that are stronger than what's there already. So if they seem a little bit strong, that one did seem to me, so I'm just going to cut a little bit more off them. And you lift up the old and feed in the new, like so. Just a simple join for the first one. So now we join the other rod, lift up in the same way. So I'm still not opening out the split rods. But the solid rods can be opened out quite hard now. Now my rods are getting thin, which means it's an ideal time to think about adding my first bice stakes. In fact, my only bice stakes in this particular skib. So usually the bice stakes are taken from the same material that you got your base sticks from. So here are my 4, or some of my base stick rods anyway. So I'm just going to select 4 of them here. one's quite a distinct belly, but it's a little bit misshapen, but I think it's still fine. And if you've got a pot of grease, it might be helpful to just dip the rods into it, like so, to ease their passage a little bit. So your first bi-stakes, and the bi-stakes go into the split rod. I'm fine with letting them peep through. If you want to let them come up a lot, that's okay, but I would tend to withdraw it a bit so that they wouldn't be too far up in the finished basket. So the advantage of doing this at this moment is that your rods are thin, so they can go nice and neatly around the bi-stakes, like so. So time for the next bi-stake. We'll have greased that already, I'd forgotten. And now my rods are almost spent, so it's time to join. So I'm going to get 2 more rods here. And I'm joining thin with thin, wheel to wheel. And you'd always weave both together for at least 1 stroke. Time to put in my next bi-stake, which is going there. You can drop the spent rod at any point, so you can leave it behind you if you prefer, or you can carry on with it. It doesn't really matter. And my last bi-stake has to go in here. So from now on, you can begin to open out all of the stakes. So it should be safe now to open this out. If you open these out too early, they tend to crease along this point. So by having patience and waiting, it will work out better. Now, when I get to this point where I need to join again, I would usually do from now on a lock join. And I'm going to explain here the difference, and also explain that in traditional basket making of this type in Ireland, the makers wouldn't have used lock joins, they'd have used simple joins instead. So I'll wait until I get to there to make the join. So a simple join is to lift up like that and piece in like that, and that's perfectly adequate at this point. As you go out, that join tends to get looser. So I would tend to do what's called in professional basket making a lock join, which is you slip it into the back pocket, you slide it in like that and weave. That's a much stronger join because that is drawn against that, and on the underside this rod is held against that base stick, so it's altogether more secure. So you can still stagger these joins, but with such a strong join there's no need to. So I would tend to do the other join now. Agus ní lána nisin sin ach leanúinte ra le fiocháin gáslaat mar sin ná go bhfuil tónaice seán sách mór. Ach úsáidem me héin slataní éagsúla sé sin chuid le dathanaí nádúrtha agus tá go le míú an bailach an dhéanam é sin anis an seo. I tend in my own bases to use coloured twigs. So I would take different varieties of willow and I tend to introduce them when I am doing a tip-to-tip join. But this is not traditional. Traditionally, when they would come to a point like this, traditional makers, they would have used not so much sorted material, unsorted material, and they would have their thinner rods at this point, and whenever they would come to a spent rod, they would lift up the old spent rod and piece in a new butt. It tends to make the weaving just a little bit rougher, but the advantage was that they were able to use absolutely every scrap of willow that they had. So here we have a few different varieties of willow. So I'm just going to show that I would usually use a minimum of 4. They don't have to be very large or anything like that. And let's say that I just use that out a little bit more and then introduce the new rod tip to tip like so. Introduce the new rod here tip to tip, and usually you would just leave the spent rod behind then after one round so that the colour of the new willow dominates. So I started doing this more by accident originally because I found that I had some very flexible willow which happened to be a Salix alba with colour, and I used to use it for the beginning of the basket. And then gradually, I suppose, opened up to the idea that one could show different varieties of willow in this way. So I tend to always use a minimum of 4 of each colour, and that's a lock join again. Simple join is that, lock join is in the back pocket, tighten and weave. And I wouldn't tend to worry so much about whether I get an exact even number of rows. I tend to focus more on using 4 rods or 8 rods as the case may be. So next time round you could use 4 more of that variety, or you could for instance use 4 of the yellows or 4 of the greens and so forth. But as I said, that is not traditional. So what was traditionally done for the most part would be that instead of opening out your base sticks as hard, you would have more by sticks. So in the case of the one I'm making, there will be just one bi-stake, but as here, there will be just one bi-stake, and all of these will be opened out so that it's even. More traditionally, they didn't put quite as much strain on their base sticks. Sometimes they weren't that flexible, and sometimes they didn't even use willow if they were stuck for willow. So here there's 3 bi-stakes, but I have still used professional basket making technique of butt to butt and tip to tip in this. But this has implication for the number of uprights you'd use, because if you try to put 2 uprights everywhere here, you have too many. That would give you 40 uprights. It would be very crowded for a basket of this size. So you tend to single stake in various places and put 2 in the more open areas. So traditionally, a lot of the time, they would have just used 1 quite strong stake per upright in that way. There's another thing I want to do now. The weaving part of this, I think, is fairly clear. It's just continuation of the same weave. Nílána cuineála fiochan gá slat, logolho yahanas dasin which. So let's say we've come to the finish of our base and we thread our rods through inside the last row. Then, traditionally, they would have taken their base and turned it upside down and put a 3-rod wale, or what we call a squailga, buine 3 slot, a tiochther. They would have put a 3-rod wale on the underside to protect the base. So tamagolakor buine 3 slot a tiochther shawanish, ramon. So go hi canas jahan shin, agus canas jahan shin. Agus cuineoidís sin le cos jahan shin. Da dograha bheochtónán an céad slot a háwas jahan shin. Ceapan go bheadh se runibeg níos éasci ach ní hinna dhéana díos de bá. So chuir díos cosas jahan shin as thosa díos rófa a déanú buine 3 slot. Ní le ceann sin in réimí gart. As you go along, you'll notice that your rods, of course, are getting thin. So there's no way that they'll be long enough usually to go the whole way. So you'll need to supplement them. So you'll probably think of doing that from about halfway on. So I should have had that pointed, I suppose. So I'm going to lift up the old, a simple join in there with another butt. And so forth. This rod is also getting thin, so I join that also. And you can join as often as you like, really, and continue to weave in this way. And now if we notice, this rod is also getting a little bit weak, so we'll supplement that one. Lift up the old, feed in the new. And here we're back to where we began. So the first one will come out under 1, the second under 2, and the final one under 3. So give your rods a clean point. It'll just make it that little bit easier to draw them through. So turlata slata shap machine. Let's go in asker machine. Let's go in darna can. Tus chicha slot. I guess a 3 can. Tus chicha 3 slot. Machine. if any of your rods were loose, you could always feed it in, not as part of the 3-rod wale, but just do an in-out stroke with it, just to make it tighter. But actually, I think that's adequate. So that is a 3-rod wale, and then you'd trim like so. I'm not trimming the inside because I actually intend not to use that 3-rod wale. I intend to replace it at some point because I no longer use this technique, but it is the traditional way of finishing a skib. Here's a skib which I'd call historically accurate, that I made more than 20 years ago as part of the IBA Basket Makers Association collection. And you can see that it has 3 rows of 3-rod wale. The inside one, this one, and the outer one. And the basket sits quite well on the outer one like that and protects it. One of the downsides of having 3 rows is that you actually have to make the base very flat, or else that doesn't engage with the base. So I prefer a slightly more domed base myself than that now. But in professional basket making, this look is frowned upon, the fact of being able to see the base sticks. And I'm not that much of a purist, but I do kind of agree that it is the slight disadvantage to this technique, because it tends to give you a bit more space and holes where the side meets the base. So for all of those reasons, I've adopted another technique which I call a German wale, and that has to be put on after you put in the uprights. So I'm going to demonstrate that next. So here I have a made base which we're now going to put uprights into. You can see that I haven't finally trimmed all the cuts, and the reason for that is that when you put in an upright, there's a little bit of displacement, so I think you get a more even cut on this section if you wait until your uprights are in. So I'm going to cut my base sticks, and this is clearly the underside, because you can see it is more like a saucer ready for a cup of tea. So as I said, traditionally a 3-rod wale would have gone out on those base sticks. So now I have these uprights already selected. So I'm going to point them. So, like so. If you're going into a very tight space with uprights, you can give it 2 cuts. There's the simple slipe, and you can give it a second slipe like so. But for this, the spaces are wide, so there's no great difficulty. Okay, so I'll point all 32 of these, and then I'll insert them. So I'm going to insert my 32 uprights here, 2 to each base stick. With the slipes facing towards me. So now I'm going to put on a technique that I call a German wale, because I learned it from German basket making, but it seems to be the one that most mirrors the 3-rod wale of the skib, in that it gives you a nice raised ridged surface. So I have 8 rods for this job. And I select my first 4 and I measure them halfway around, like so. I get my knife and cut off all the excess tips. And then if there's a particular area that there was a bit of a dip, you might say that would be a good place to have my butts. So I think that would be that area. So I'm going to start in the opposite area here. And I'm going to use my kneeler. And this will be a 4-rod wale. Almost all of the wales that are on over uprights tend to be 4-rod, because otherwise the ridge will be too low that the wale causes. So I'm anchoring my 4 twigs like that. And remember that they're long enough to go a little bit more than halfway around the base. So that's your first rod anchored, the second rod anchored, the third rod anchored, and the fourth rod anchored. And this goes outside the base stick. A pull down wale, which is another variation, can go in there, but with this you go outside the base stick, so you need to cut your base sticks quite flush. So the weave is in front of 3, behind 1. And you can use this as a way of spreading your uprights, but that's really to some extent up to yourself. Some people will do that later, but I'd always spread them just a little bit for no other reason than it makes the wale a little bit easier. So you can see the crucial thing here is to divide the stroke. Don't go in and out with one movement, because that will mean that it will be there won't be enough tension in the weave. So go in, hold, come out. Go in, hold, come out, and so forth. And of course you have to move your position probably 3 times or 4 times in all, so that you're So if you look, you'll notice we're almost halfway across from where we began. And now it's time to join. And whereas normally you'd never slipe or point waling rods, I'm actually going to point 2 of these, because 2 of the spaces will be tight. So it's possibly just as easy to point them all, because it means that whatever you pick up will be adequate. So here's a tight spot, and you feed in butt to butt, like so. Here's your next join. And if you have any difficulty in applying this technique initially, it might be a good idea to stagger your joins, cut your rods a little bit longer and join one a little early and one a little late, because you'll have more tension that way. So 1, 2, this is your next rod to join. So again, it's in a tight spot, so you'd want a sliped weaver for that. So I'm going to cut these out so that the picture will be a little bit clearer. It's not the proper trimming. So if you look at our weavers, 1, 2, 3, 4, so this is our final one. So for instance, if this one was long enough, you could weave that again. It would create a little bit more tension and hold things together. But I usually join the 4 at the same place. And now my position of work is uncomfortable and not that powerful, so I have to move yet again, and I'll kneel there. Excuse me. So here we are. We're back to where we began. So in terms of finishing, the first rod goes in front of 3, behind 1, but there's nothing of the new material in front of that upright. So you simply just in front of 3, behind 1, and tuck it in like so and hold it with your knee. Now I'm going to point these 3 rods because I'll need to thread through. The next time, in front of 3, behind 1, brings me out under 1. So the first goes under nothing, the second goes under 1, like so. I'll move slightly. The third will go out under 2. And the fourth and final rod will go out under 3. If for any reason, having done this, you find you're a little bit short of tension, you could always take the rod again, not as part of a wale, but rather put it in and out one weave, and then that would hold it. So that's that corrected. And now it's time to just trim all those pieces. So turn the hole, and I will also trim on this side. Now I'm going to get my blunt knife and kink each of these in turn. So I put the knife in like so, and then turn the knife and bring it up in the same motion. So, and it's important when you come to the point where you've finished your wale to ensure that the uprights help you to create tension. So don't just accept where the uprights are. So here's an instance. Push this in with your knife and then turn, and that will give you great tension underneath. So now I'm going to put a weight on this just to stabilize it. And traditionally we would have always brought up the uprights as opposites because it's a split base, so as opposed to being an underfoot base. So 2 from north, 2 from south. Oh, and there's a rod that will have to be replaced, but I'll replace it after the fact. 2 from east and 2 from west. Okay, so I'm going to put a hoop on this basket and release the uprights into the hoop. But traditionally, what would have happened would be that the uprights would have been tied. This would have been done, and I'm just going to demonstrate it here with the rod, which trills around. And then you twirl the rod like that and feed it up into the work, like so. I much prefer a hoop for a few reasons. First of all, you heard a cracking sound earlier, so I have an upright to replace. It's very easy to do if I use a hoop. So instead of using that tie, I'm going to slide this down like this. But the downside to a hoop is that you have to have a few different sizes. So if you wanted to make something sloping out, obviously you'd have to have a wider hoop, etc. But now I'm going to attend to my broken rod. You see it there? And if your hoop was sloping out, you'd also tie it or secure it in a few places. So there's my broken rod, and that's not something you'd want to leave in your basket. So you ease it out somewhat, and once you've eased it out a little bit, you could keep the space open with your bodkin, like so. Take it out. By all means, give the rod one more chance. So feed it in again. I'm not going to bother getting my blunt knife now for this. I'll use my sharp knife instead. And then you can swirl it in under the hoop, like so. And then we're ready to weave. Okay, so now I'm going to tap in my uprights all the way around. And next I will begin to wale, the 3-rod wale, and I will start somewhere other than where I began and ended the German wale. So I'll begin here and here. Here we go. And that's my bi-stake here, and I'll begin on the rod to the left of it, anchoring like that. Lift up in the air and fold it behind. And I begin my 3-rod wale. Agus seo the host buidir a fiochan seo as gaigana buine 3 slot. A seirt a gceist go hí an slot atá tíobh de lámha clé go se os cór péire nó bailach a líle dearcahar tá se go isteach sa spás áit bhfuil a can dearnach a dúthachas. So the left-hand rod is going in the gap that the right-hand rod is coming out of, and in the process it's going in front of 2. So I intend to chase, as in begin in 2 places so that there won't be any join on the bottom row. But I should also mention that if you were looking at a traditional skib, the likelihood is that the makers would have begun in this way. They would have got 3 butts, just like that, and begun to weave in front of 2, behind 1 like that. There would have been no chasing, and whenever the rod got thin, they would have put in a new butt going in where the tip was spent. So it was a slightly rougher weave, but that's how they did it. So now I've almost come to the point, the opposite point. I began to the left of my bi-stake. So it's probably a good idea to have begun in a memorable spot so you'll easily recognize your opposite point. So there's my bi-stake. So I began just to the left of the bi-stake. So by bi-stake I mean the rod that I added. So 1, 2, and 3, lift up and fall behind. And sometimes with a hoop it may list a little bit to the left and right, so if you spot that, make sure you correct it. And usually the rods you're waling with are a little bit thinner than your uprights. But they have to be long enough to go at least halfway around, or if not, as in the case of that very large skib behind me, you might start in 4 places. Instead of starting at north-south, you might also have an east and west starting point as well. And where these finish on one side, you would always be careful that the others finish in the opposite place. So if these aren't long enough to go there, you'd reverse that back 1, so that everything is symmetrical and regular. And in that way it can be seen that there is no join on the first row. So I've gone 1 further over on the other side, so I'll take that one back. So simple joins always for waling. So you continue building the sides in that way, next time joining tip with tip, but not allowing the rods to get much thinner than that, and build it up until you have about 6 rows of weaving and finishing with tips. So I have woven up the sides of my skib, so I'm just going to give it a final tapping down here. And I release my hoop like that. Take out my weight for a moment because I want to have a look at it and see if I'm happy with the circularity of it. If you felt it needed correcting in any way, you can actually squeeze a little bit and correct in that way. But I usually look at my skibs from above and just see that it's fairly circular. If there was a particular place where it was bulging out a little bit, I might not correct that. I might instead say, I'll begin in that spot, because usually where you begin is inclined to drag in ever so slightly. So to my eye, it's bulging ever so slightly there, so I'll begin my border there. Tá go le tosnú ar a caisín in ish, agus solanyanama sin, tá ma dúra go le brantha gúil an kishoga hain sá crin, agus ma tá se gobu mark rúne beag tosam an caisín ag a punche sin. Tá ma go le tosnú in show. So if I make a large skib, even the size I'm making there, I would nearly always put on a 6-pair border, which is a wider border than would have been traditionally the case. But for the skib I'm making here, I'm going to put on a 5-pair border. So a 6-pair border means that you initially knock 6 rods, so the span of the rods is greater, so it gives you a wider border. But you do have to have thicker uprights for that to work. So I'm going to kink my uprights about 2 thicknesses of rod. So 1 thickness, 2 thicknesses, so somewhere about there. If I was doing a 6-pair border, I would have gone marginally higher. But for a 5-pair, this should be adequate. And when I was talking about the other base with the 3 bi-stakes, I was saying that sometimes they would use single uprights, so they often went for a 4-pair border. But for me, almost the minimum border I do is a 5-pair. So I have kinked 6 rods, so I'm ready to go. So take rod number 1 behind 2 others, the second rod behind 2 others, the third behind 2 others, the fourth similarly, and the 5th. So just to mention, if you were doing a 6-pair, you'll be kinking that as well, in which case you would put pegs here to help your border flow out. But for a 5-pair, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are ready to go. At most, for a 5-pair, you might just put in 1 peg just to make the first rod flow out a little bit. And it's not even necessary. So this is the accompaniment of that. And you work your first 1 or 2 rods slightly loosely, and I nearly always now use my knife for kinking all the way through. So I keep it there handy. So that's been pre-kinked. And just going back, there's a little bit of skin damage on that one. So I'm going to just show how I would replace a broken rod. So usually I would hold the space like that with my bodkin, cut. You could say offer the rod one last chance to be in the basket, but it depends. If it's fairly thin, I wouldn't do that. But anyway, place it in like that. One, two, three, four, 5 pairs, and you're always taking the right-hand rod of your pair like this. And then, so if this rod doesn't kink well this time, you'd replace it with another rod. But actually, it's fine. And it's quite a useful thing to know that a broken rod in basket making is not a big deal. That rod is a tiny little bit too tightly pulled there, so feed it back. The reason I'm using the knife is, first of all, this is a fairly hard type of willow. It's called Harrison's and it's been steamed. But I also like that quality in a willow while I'm bordering, because it means that where it spans is very strong and not as prone to kinking. But I also like the knuckle, as I call it, the bent area of the rod, to be slightly higher than the rest of the border, so that when impact comes, this will prevent it from sliding in. I sometimes do 2 at a time. I can take that out of the way. So this has been kinked already. So when you come to the finish like this, one of the nice advantages of sitting low, I think, is that it allows you to put this under your feet like that, so your 2 hands are free, which is really a necessity. So I'm going to take that forked piece off that and feed through like so. Still going in front of 2, behind 1. So that behind 1 translates to under 1. Flatten that down like that, so that that eases into its groove. Kink. And now I get my bodkin and grease. Just leave a little film of grease in there. And try to think of this as taking the longest possible journey to come through. So instead of trying to come through in a hurry, you put it back there first and you nurse it through like that. Also, one of the reasons why you need a good heavy weight in your basket. So we grease up again. This is our next empty space. This is the knuckle belonging to the next empty space. So you put your bodkin out under the knuckle. I used to be very casual before I began teaching, and I could often put it this way. But as a result of showing others, I've kind of even taught myself to always put the bodkin facing outwards, because it becomes so much clearer what the rod has to do. So out under the knuckle, like so. And again, giving it as much support. So the left hand is the more important of the two hands. And flatten that down every time. And my blunt knife is here. And again, I have a slightly damaged fork here. So. And again, way out there first. Okay, so grease up your bodkin. Here's your next empty space. Here's the knuckle belonging to it. So you have 5 pairs to deal with. So in the case of the first of the 5 pairs, this right hand rod will go out under a total of 1, namely the knuckle only. And once you get that begun, you can transfer the bodkin to another place so that the passage for the rod is relatively easy. And then finally, flatten down and, crucially, use your bodkin as a lever so that the rod you've pulled through is slightly below and therefore has a better chance of being trapped. So here's your next empty space, the knuckle again, and this time there's a rod outside the knuckle, so the total will be 2. But this rod will be fed out under 2. And again, once you get going, you can transfer the bodkin slightly so that the passage for the rod is relatively easy. And flatten down and using your bodkin as a lever up like that, so it's in a good trapped position. Here's your next empty space, the knuckle belonging to it, and this time your total is 3, the knuckle and 2 other rods. That tells me I'm dealing with my third of 5 pair, and also a slightly damaged fork on that. Again, flatten down and using the bodkin as a lever, which is one of the reasons why I always like a blunt bodkin for bordering. So there's your next empty space. There's the knuckle belonging to it. So this time the total is 4. And this is your 5th and final pair, and that rod will be going out under a total of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Támuid threis cashing garo críoch ní haní segan agus ní lán nach a slat dearnach agus seo an cúig péire, so tá seo go amach faoi cúig slat agus nuair atá do dhéanú birir borna slatte mar seo agus túr cad go golasteach agus an sin scuile bodicín agus túr cad go amach mar seo. A sin íon tú bhrúar dús agus an sin é a hairint. Agus bhrú síos mar sinna is go sé deas corm. Agus sinna bhfuil mar gapan tú chun rud a bit sort deastín fáis gúhaid túr ggóha ach ní hapan gúil ar a bunte seo, so ní lán is ach é a garú. That's the border completed. If you thought there was any place where the rods were loose, you could by all means tighten them. Sometimes if you've given a lot of play at the beginning, you might tighten there. But I think it's actually okay so we're ready to trim. So I usually pull very gently towards me like this, and I'm kind of guided by the knuckle, so I pull as far as the knuckle but not beyond. So here's my bundle of cut-off tops. These weren't, I kind of selected rods that were short and a little bit branchy for this, so the cut-off tops aren't of great use. But normally you might design a project that you would have, you might use the cut-off tops, for instance, as some of the siding of the waling for your next skib or something like that. If that's the case, you'd usually take your little bundle and take one of the rods, and you'd give it a little twirl like that and slide it and give it just a loose tie like that. And if they're quite damp, you might slide that up to allow them to dry a little bit, but it's a way of keeping them tidy until you use them. So all that remains now is to take the skib off the board and to trim the sides. You'll trim the insides in a similar way, and you can use your shears as a lever somewhat, and if space is tight you can take your bodkin and use that as a lever to cut in that way. So having trimmed all, then I go back and look at my German wale, which rods I've left a little bit long. So now they're all very secure in their position, so they can be retrimmed a little bit tighter. I would also tend, the butts don't tend to need as much, but I'll still take a little bit more off those as well, so that they're not catching in anything. And as somebody who has eyesight not quite as good as it used to be, I tend to always put my hand around like that just to make sure that I haven't left any cuts outstanding.